Hello, everybody. You'll recall that last time we talked about a model for evolution. And in it, we saw that natural selection creates changes in frequencies of traits or genes. And we called this microevolution, and that these microevolutionary events repeated over thousands of years create macroevolution, changes in the structure and the appearance of an organism. What we didn't talk about last time was what a species is and how speciation occurs. So we're going to tackle that today. Evolution is fundamentally about the origin of species. The species we see on Earth today, where did they come from? How did they get here? Why did we have so many of them? Why are there the kinds of species that we have? Those are the kinds of questions that are fundamentally evolutionary. So the first thing we need to do is define the word species. And one way to do that is to simply say that two organisms are different species if they have different physical appearance. This is known as the morphological species concept because morphology is simply the form and the structure of an organism. So the first species concepts ever applied were morphological species concepts. Now, if we look at the fossil record, we find two different kinds of patterns that we need to think about. In the first one, you may have a single lineage and large macroevolutionary changes occur in that lineage without there ever being branching, and that's shown in the left-hand side of the figure. In other words, we started off with a black-colored dinosaur, we ended up with this turquoise-colored dinosaur, and that represents change where this is now clearly a different species morphologically than its ancestor. This within lineage change, it's called anagenesis. But a second pattern arises from the fossil record, and that is that biodiversity, the number of species, increases over time. And this means that a lineage must split or bifurcate a single population into two species. And this branching pattern repeated over time causes an increase in the number of species. And this type of evolution is called cladogenesis. Natural selection and random processes account for anagenesis very nicely. We have the whole microevolution, macroevolution model that we've already set out. But it can account for cladogenesis. And for that, we need to understand how two species are formed from a single ancestral species. In order to understand speciation, imagine a single species with two populations that are slightly separated. And in this diagram, you can see population 1 has developed a new mutation signified by the red coloration, while population 2 has developed a different new mutation signified by the blue mutation. If some members of each population disperse to the other population, as shown in the bottom diagram, then both populations will always contain the same traits. The movement and interbreeding of individuals from different populations is termed gene flow. And gene flow ensures that populations remain the same species. And you can think of it this way. They're the same species because they share genetic information. When gene flow doesn't occur, the two populations begin to have separate evolutionary histories. We can mark that as the beginning of the speciation process. A Harvard ornithologist named Ernst Mayr recognized this idea and coined the biological species concept as follows. He said, species are groups of interbreeding natural populations that are reproductively isolated from other such groups. So think of what that means. It means that you might have a set of populations and they cannot interbreed with another group of individuals represented by a different set of populations. So those two sets of populations would be two separate species. Reproductive isolation, remember, means that the populations cannot interbreed. They cannot mate with each other. Now, traditionally, the biological species concept has been interpreted to mean that if two populations can potentially interbreed in nature and produce viable, fertile offspring, then they are the same species. If they can't interbreed, they are reproductively isolated and thus separate species. Now, the biological species concept is conceptually very nice. For example, it allows for variation in populations, which is so important for natural selection to occur. You can have lots of variation, but as long as all these variants are able to mate with each other, then they're the same species. They're also a natural unit because they're isolated in reproduction and therefore in evolutionary time from other such groups. So it's a very satisfying concept. Later on, we may take up some of the problems with the biological species concept and look at yet other species concepts that people use. Let's just quickly look at reproductive isolation one more time to make sure it's clear. In this example, a single population splits into two reproductively isolated populations. So here they are, reproductively isolated. And now, since mutations are random, the two populations develop different mutations. This one developed what's represented as a yellow mutation, this one a purple mutation. Then natural selection will favor some of these mutations, in this case the yellow, in this case over here the purple. And then finally, the two populations will have only that one trait. They'll be fixed for that trait. And at some point in the process, these two populations lose the ability to mate with each other. Now, there's a lot packed into that statement, and we'll unpack that maybe later on. But that's our idea of how reproductive isolation causes speciation. How do new species form? Well, the most common and perhaps most obvious way for populations to become reproductively isolated is by the occurrence of geographical isolation, which is called allopatry. And that can occur when physical barriers form. And these physical barriers include things like mountain ranges, rivers, oceans, etc. And we'll talk more about this later on. This is called allopatric speciation because the word allopatry means different homelands. And so you can see in this model here, we have a stand of trees and a river divides them, and over time they become different species. Now, it is possible for speciation to occur when two populations live in the same place, as long as reproductive isolation still occurs. So reproductive isolation is really the key to speciation. And that's called sympatric speciation and is illustrated down here, where you get two species of trees forming despite the lack of geographical isolation. I'll leave you to think about how sympatric speciation might occur. It's more complex, and for a long time biologists didn't think it could occur. But now we're recognizing more and more ways it can occur, and maybe you can figure out a new way that it could occur, so you should think about that. Here are two graphical models of how allopatric speciation might occur. One is a geographic barrier, which occurs, as we've just seen in the last example, and here's one where a little peripheral population on the edge of the range gets isolated and becomes effectively reproductively isolated from the main population. Here's a real-life example of reproductive isolation. The Kaibab and the Abert squirrel. One occurs on the north rim, one occurs on the south rim of the Grand Canyon. 20,000 years ago, there was no Grand Canyon, just one large population of happily interbreeding squirrels. By 10,000 years ago, when the Grand Canyon formed, ancestors of the Kaibab and Abert squirrels became reproductively isolated. In just 10,000 years, several distinguishing features have evolved for each population. As you can see there's slightly different amount of tufting in the ears. You can see the coloration differences, and there must be other differences as well. This just goes to show that even in short amount of time, you can get a lot of differentiation. Can they interbreed? I don't know. The Grand Canyon means that in nature they don't interbreed. And I love to imagine those first years when the river was just running through what would become the Grand Canyon and what it must have been like. And as you can see from this cartoon, there was strong selective pressure against trying to interbreed. There was strong selective pressure to only want to breed with your own type on your own side of the river. One thing I think it's important to bring up right now is that speciation occurs in fits and starts. When two populations become isolated, they diverge, which means they begin the process of speciation. If they come back into contact at a later point, there are three distinct possibilities of what will happen next. One, they may be reproductively isolated. They can't interbreed for any of a number of reasons, and thus we would call them different species. Two, they may interbreed, but their offspring would have lower fitness, which would mean the offspring don't do very well. This would mean there'd be strong selection against interbreeding, and that would probably mean that even though they can technically mate and have babies, that we would still consider them two separate species. Finally, they may freely mate and share genes and are thus still one species. And that's what's shown in this diagram here, where you have a western and eastern deer population. They've developed a color difference, but now a mountain pass is formed. They're starting to emigrate from each population to the other, and interbreeding is occurring, so there is gene flow occurring, and even though they started to diverge, now their evolutionary paths come back together, and so speciation didn't occur. Speciation has a very deep implication for evolution, and that is that you can think about the history of life as a branching tree. And here is an evolutionary tree for all of life. And you can see that here we are, mammals, but here are starfish, and here are plants, and here are sponges, right? They all come off at different times. So in the next talk, what we are going to do is look at what it means that life has branched in tree-like fashion. Until that time, you should go outside, you should observe nature, you should think about biology while you're observing nature, and you should ask questions about biology. And I'll see you next time.